Today we are doing one very unusual theory of ethics called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism deals with calculating utility. And based on that, it wants to find out what is ethical. The author of this theory is Bentham of 19th century. See, historically, what is ethical is considered as something good for others, but which may turn out to be bad for oneself. Historically, what is ethical is considered to be moving away from one's own instincts and pleasures and helping others, making others happy. But Bentham proposed something which is different, very radical in that sense. He said that what is ethical cannot be beyond what is pleasure. To him, what gives pleasure is what is ethical. Pleasure as ethics, very radical. He is saying that there is no criteria beyond the pleasure to judge what is moral and what is ethical. But naturally, what is pleasure to you may be pain to others. So he wants to calculate, and then when it comes to pleasure, one has to see how much pleasure one is getting and how much pain it is leading to others. So he wants to calculate all those things. Suppose you are doing something out of which 5 people get pleasure and you also get pleasure. So you are getting 10 units of pleasure and 5 others are getting 5 units of pleasure each. So 10 plus 25, 35. And 3 others are getting pain, and pain of maybe 6 units. Out of your action, there is 35 plus and minus 18. but net result is plus. So it is ethical. It is as simple as that. So calculation of pleasures and pains on others. So greatest happiness of greatest number of people is what is moral. It is based on that one should determine, and there is nothing beyond this. So no religion can tell us what is good. No heaven and hell, no God, no sacred text. It's all what gives oneself and others happiness. Of course, Bentham is not making any distinction between happiness and pleasure. He is not saying happiness is something more than pleasure. So what you see in this approach is that division of man's action into pleasures and pains, and quantification, calculation, and assumption that all the pleasures added gives greater pleasure. Plus 150 pleasure is more than plus 100. And small pleasures added, it will give great pleasure. And pleasure of many would lead to pleasure of society. And pleasure of society is happiness of society. And there is no morality outside the pursuit of pleasure and minimization of pain. So the idea that there is nothing ethical beyond pleasure may be somewhat justified, maybe in certain cases. But it leads to certain obvious problems. Take for example, 10 boys enjoy teasing a girl. Each boy gets a pleasure of plus 5. And a girl might get a pain of minus 30. But pleasure is more than pain. So there is nothing unethical in boys teasing the girl. Nothing unethical according to these calculations. When 10 are getting pleasure and the total pleasure is more than the total pain. So definitely there is a serious error in this. Bentham doesn't raise the question of how one is deriving pleasure. Some people would say this is not the way to get pleasure at all. And such pleasure itself is unethical. But to Bentham, there is nothing which is ethical or unethical beyond the pleasure-pain calculation. So, some say there is something wrong with this. Many would say there is something wrong with this. This is not ethical at all. How some people can get pleasure out of teasing and think that is a moral action. So, it's an obvious error. That is why what is ethical involves rights. In this case of the girl, and how in the pursuit of one's pleasure, one shouldn't cause pain unless this pleasure is somehow justified for something else. But however the way you want to explain, it becomes clear that pleasure cannot be equated with morality. That's one way of looking at it. But there are other problems also. Bentham misses one very, very important point, that pleasure and pain are linked. He assumes that you should pursue pleasure, maximize pleasure, and avoid pain, minimize pain. But then pleasure and pain are linked. Examination success gives you pleasure. Why that pleasure? Because there is a possibility of failure, which is pain. So when you are working hard for the exam, what are you pursuing? You can say you are pursuing pleasure, but you can also say you are pursuing, in fact, pain. Because more people fail in the exam, particularly in a competitive examination. So, if you think of the probability of pleasure, then one may have to do something which can easily be done, so that there is no possibility of pain. But then there is no possibility of higher pleasure also. So pleasure and pain are linked. The pursuit of pleasure always gives the possibility of pain. In fact, the pleasure is coming out of escaping the pain, and the pain is coming because of missing of the pleasure. Pleasure and pain are not two separate things by which you can maximize pleasure and minimize pain. And also, going through the pain, a lot of pain is for the pursuit of possible pleasure in the end. So, pleasure and pain linked, coming side by side, and linked chronologically. Going through pain may give pleasure. So, these are interlinked process. One can't maximize pleasure and then minimize pain. And moreover, what is this maximization of pleasure? He thinks that pleasure 1, pleasure 2, pleasure 3, pleasure 4, all things added will make life happy. That would be a meaningless way of looking at it. That would be so stupid. A kid born to rich parents may have many facilities. He may get a pleasure of a car, pleasure of a tour, pleasure of good travel, pleasure of good sports, But all pleasures added may not make him meaningful because he is getting probably what all he wants. And he is deprived of going through the pain. And so the possibility of getting something that is truly happy. So the idea that all pleasures added make life richer is meaningless. Life has its own rhythm. It's not addition of pleasures. In fact, I would like to say, pleasure is not happiness, and true happiness is in negotiating this pleasure-pain cycle. Pleasure and pain are inevitable. They can't be separated. Happiness comes out of dealing with the pleasure-pain link, that whatever you try, whatever the pleasure you seek, may lead to pain. And we should accept pain as much as a part of life, like the way we accept pleasure. And in accepting pleasure and pain as a part of life, we tend to think beyond pleasure and pain and try to make life more meaningful. So, thinking in terms of pleasure and pain is very narrow way of looking at life. But Bentham's student John Stuart Mill did realize that there is some problem with utilitarianism. He raised this question that Socrates might have led a discontent life. So, by utilitarian calculation, it is pain. Whereas a well-fed pig is happy. So, pleasure. So, plus. So, Socrates' Socratic life is inferior to that of a pig. So, John Stuart Mill got this idea. Then he divided pleasures into higher pleasures and lower pleasures. So he would say that 10 boys teasing a girl, those boys are experiencing lower pleasure. Fine, it may be lower pleasure, but still Mill thinks that it is pleasure. So even after dividing this into higher and lower, the essential problem of equating pleasure with morality is not a workout. But Mill raises the question that probably pursuit of pleasure itself is not a noble goal. So discontented life of Socrates may be nobler. But Mill, instead of rejecting utilitarianism, he is pleased with classifying into higher pleasure and lower pleasure. And so Socratic life gives a higher pleasure. And anyway, interestingly, according to Mill, how do we classify what is higher and lower? He said, the people who have seen both the types of pleasure know what is higher and what is lower. So Buddha renounced the world, renounced kingdom, pursued spiritual goals. So spiritual goal must be giving higher pleasure compared to ruling kingdom. So that's how Mill would argue. But this division doesn't answer the basic problem of utilitarianism. But this raises the question that what is pain need not be avoided, and what is pleasure need not be sought. So this Mill didn't conclude. He just thought he would get over the problem simply by classifying pleasures into higher and lower. But it is not an answer to problems that utilitarianism gives. So one has to accept that pleasure and pain are very narrow ways of thinking, and sometimes we need to accept pain to get pleasure, and sometimes the pleasure we get is unworthy of it, of our seeking it. So pleasure and pain are not the ways of looking at life at all, and definitely it has nothing to do with morality. And happiness is different from pleasure and pain, and man should try to understand how to negotiate with this pleasure-pain cycle, and not how to maximize pleasure and minimize pain.